That man will lend you a hand. That man will guard your land. That man will understand. That man is Batman. Batman. That man is Batman. That man is faster than the latest high-tech police van. Just ask any librarian. That man is Batman. Batman. That man is Batman. When the wave of crime began, he was already with a plan. He locked the Joker in the garbage can. That man is Batman. Batman. That man is Batman.
Hey, what's up, Previews Earl? Welcome back to another roundtable discussion brought to you by Previews World. You guys seem to really enjoy these roundtables, particularly when we tackle conversations that cut right into the heart of nerd social media. So we got a doozy for you today. A few years ago, the conversation around American comics and manga seemed to kick into high gear, particularly around that the U.S. market is dying and was destined to be supplanted by Japanese comics translated to English. Every few months, this conversation returns with more fervor. Admittedly, a lot of this is just clickbait, but there's a conversation there. Will manga completely take over the American comic industry? Is this a bad thing? Is it already happening? Well, in order to do this, I need more perspective to make this roundtable discussion well-rounded. So, without further ado, let me introduce this month's crew of opinionated nerds, which is hard to find, of course. First up, Chris Piers of Comic Tropes. How's it going, Chris?
Hey, Troy. Good to see you again, buddy.
Good to see you, too. Absolutely. Also joining us is James Easterly, indie cartoonist, who is also assistant creative director for Comix Well Spring.
Hey, guys.
There you go. And, so, see, I knew this was going to happen. And under the gun, making it in, Kurenai, Kiba, cosplayer, writer, illustrator, and ChromaKon chair.
Hello.
Very nice.
We weren't talking about you. We're just more like, where is she? We got to start. So thank you for jumping in.
No, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We had Kurenai on before during the Cowboy Bebop roundtable. That was a lot of fun, right?
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was. So, at this point, you're kind of becoming my go-to manga and anime person. So, can you just accept that for me?
I really enjoy that. Yes, I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, how's everybody doing?
Aces.
All right. Cool. I accept it. So, all right, off the break, let's just get this out of the way. Manga, comic books are the same thing, right? It's a format, right?
Agreed.
So let's just get that out of the way. Yes, all right, okay. Everybody's
sequential storytelling, right? Panel to panel storytelling.
Thank you, Will Eisner, exactly. But not everyone understands this, right? So let's get that out of the way. But first, I want to talk credentials because, like it or not, being a fan of this stuff always means someone's going to test your knowledge, right? So let's do origin stories. How did you first get into manga? And Chris, since you're closest to me, you're going to go first.
Okay. I think that the first manga I was exposed to, I wasn't necessarily aware that it was manga, because if you go back to sort of the late 80s, there was stuff like Rai Psychic Girl that was
Mm-hmm.
getting like published by indie publishers. And I was just like, okay, this is different, but I didn't necessarily understand that it was from Japan. But I
Mm-hmm.
probably got into it a lot more, um, I don't know, with stuff like Blade of the Immortal and various Naoki Urasawa comics, Pluto, Monster, that kind of stuff like really drew me in, and it started getting me excited. Now that I'm thinking of it, the Lone Wolf and Cub was another one that I was exposed to early on.
Mm-hmm.
So little
Okay,
bits,
cool.
and then it just sort of became more and more easy to get a hold of it, so it became easier to appreciate it.
And I'm actually going to add one more thing to this that I forgot to mention before. As an addition, had you already experienced anime at that point? Like, had you, like, whether you knew it or not, had you already experienced that?
Absolutely. Personally, I definitely remember. I'm probably like the oldest one here or something, but anyway, like I remember in like the late 70s, I think, seeing stuff like Guy King on TV.
Mm-hmm.
So again, at that age, to me, it was just cartoons, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was stuff that was being like brought over here that you could
Right.
absolutely see on TV.
No, absolutely. What about you, Kurenai? What was your first experience with manga? And also, had you experienced anime before that?
I did. Actually, I experienced anime way before. But
Mm-hmm.
mine was more of an introduction to like Gigantor,
Mm-hmm.
Speed Racer, all those kinds of things. And I was the same as Chris. It was a lot where I just kind of accepted it as cartoons. I just knew that these were, I didn't, you couldn't quite put it in the words that they were just different,
Mm-hmm.
but you still loved them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say, because what I used to do is that I used to do gaming tournaments at Hollywood Video.
Okay.
To fund
Uh,
to fund my anime. And then once I realized that I could buy manga with it too at
nah.
FP, I was there every weekend.
Mhm.
Every weekend. I think my first one that I was able to purchase with my own money was Yu Hakusho.
Okay. All right. Awesome. What about you, James? First manga, and did you already know about anime before that?
Oh, absolutely. When you're in elementary school and it's early morning and you do not want to go outside to get to the bus right away, you're glued to the TV screen.
Mhm.
And for me, that started off with things like Pokemon, Sailor Moon, and Dragon Ball Z, of course. And I vaguely remember having a floppy version, comics-wise floppy. So just for anyone who's unfamiliar with that terminology here. So a floppy, your book is floppy.
You're right.
But I'm pretty sure I had a floppy of the manga version of Pokemon early on. And then once Toonami started coming through and then Adult Swim started putting stuff up, I got myself some Trigun, and then eventually stuff like One Piece. Fooly Cooly came through at some point. This is the manga adaptation. And for anyone deep cuts, Azumanga Daioh. So that was kind of my entry, my gateway into manga.
Okay, cool. Just real quick, for me, I think the first one I read, or at least I remember buying, was Gunsmith Cats, which was being republished by Dark Horse, and I've always been kind of way into action movie stuff, so that was kind of perfect for me. And I think it was interesting because I had been an Archie person for a while. I started with Archie, transitioned to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then once I discovered Marvel, I was done with Ninja Turtles. But I did start to pick up all the other stuff that came afterwards. So I got into DC, and then from DC, I got to give credit where credit's due. Thanks to Wizard for exposing me to other comic books, I started reading other comics, right? And also Image kind of branching off from Marvel on top of that. Or the creators branching off from Marvel, I should say. But yeah, I remember Gunsmith Cats was kind of an easy sell. It had, guns, cars, and it also had a little nudity, so that was also an easy sell for a 13-year-old me as well.
I just remember, Troy, that it was really hard to decide if either a manga comic or an anime was any good. Kurenai made me think of this when she mentioned Hollywood Video. Going back further, something like Suncoast Video used to always have like a little anime section, but this was before the internet, so you didn't really have any reviews. You basically have to look at that cover and like read the back and go like, I'm making a judgment call here. And sometimes you kind of got burned. It was like the animation wasn't that great, and sometimes you found something really cool.
I can already tell who's in what age range, and I definitely think James is the youngest, just based off the anime he referenced. But we're not going to hold that against you, man. So, all right, why do you think this conversation of manga versus American comic books is so heated currently? Because for me, this is a fairly new thing that's really only started to pop up in the last 5 years, I want to say. I remember small versions of it, like maybe about 20 years ago, when there was that initial wave where guys like Tokyo Pop were in the American market with like translations. But I mean, truthfully, for a kid of the 80s, like the manga stuff has always been around in some form or another. I mean, you talked about Lone Wolf and Cub and like Blade of the Immortal. Akira came out in the 80s through Epic. Like all that stuff has always been around. So I never thought that there need to be a versus conversation. But I'm curious, why do you think it's like taking hold now? And so I see you leaning in here, Kurenai. What do you got to say?
Honestly, I just feel that it's in the nature of nerds to always have a versus battle. No matter what it is, whether it's, I mean, this conversation is longer than the conversation we've been having about Superman versus Goku. So I strongly feel that it's just one of those things that's always been so thoroughly in our, especially in American nerd culture when it comes to it. It's like we always have to find the answer to something, even if there is no answer.
Yeah.
And plus, they're so very similar when it comes to like their absolute cores that you can't help but compare and contrast.
We did an episode of the panel where I got to watch, I got to read My Hero Academia for the first time. And I was kind of floored by how much it reminded me of like 80s, 90s Marvel comics. Like that really did surprise the hell out of me. New Mutants, very much New Mutants, absolutely. And it kind of immediately got me because of that. I was like, oh, turns out this book is for me. So what about you, Chris? How do you think this conversation of manga versus American comics is, why do you think it's so heated currently?
Well, I think that, first of all, Kurenai has a great point. Like it used to be, we'd argue Marvel versus DC, or maybe like, when the sort of late 80s indie stuff came out, like Ninja Turtles or Tick or Sagi, like it was like indie versus like mainstream and stuff. And manga is just a super popular type of comics out there. It obviously sells very well. I think that there's also, with some nerds, conversations about, say, the all ages books by people like Raina Telgemeier that are like selling gangbusters in your Walmarts and your Targets. I mean, that's comics too. But Captain Underpants, there you go, Dogman. That kind of stuff sells really, really well. Boy, that was fast, by the way. That was really fast. You had that queued up.
I had that queued up. I was like, somebody's going to mention either Raina or Captain Underpants. I was ready.
Well, because it's all just types of different ways of arguing it. And it clearly sells well. But I think we also just need to keep one thing in mind, and that's, we're only seeing essentially a small portion of manga make it to, your Barnes and Noble and stuff. This is a very curated selection that tends to be stuff that's going to hit well with Western audiences. I've got a good friend, Zach Davison, who's a translator of manga, and I talk with him sometimes. There's so much manga out there that like culturally would not be as likely to connect with us. And we don't see that. We tend to see like the best of the best that we will respond to. And of course, people like that stuff, like we're seeing the cream of the crop is all I'm saying. And it's kind of easy to sort of compare that cream of the crop to just everything you see on the comic book store shelves. Some of it good, some of it bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a little response here. It's the same thing with sports nerds / fans going tribal, defending their favorite and degrading the opposite side. I mean, part of me feels like that's our God-given right as nerds. Sometimes I'm not upset with it, but sometimes I'm like, do we need to argue about this? James, what about you? Why do you think this conversation has become so heated lately?
So I'm going to piggyback on the idea that this comes and goes every generation or two. And I bet the way I would see this, the more I think about it, is every time there's a new hit anime, it just retroactively goes back to manga in a certain sense, because the differentiation between those two are very slim in terms of how the adaptations are handled. So I can see how a lot of people will take the conversation around, this is like Chainsaw Man is a big thing right now. Like I remember being at Motor City Comic Con the other weekend and seeing a kid that was maybe no older than 10 years old dressed up as Chainsaw Man running around. And I think it plays to that idea of there is a certain level of people in the States that are a little exhausted with American comics who might not see the full breadth of what comics are available. So when they're usually partaking in reading and watching anime and manga, they're not seeing the full breadth of stuff that's out there. So they're coming to the conclusion that they're exhausted with the Marvel movie. So why would I go to the comic book shop? I've seen too much of this. So I'm going to stick to what I know, which is my Dragon Balls, my Chainsaw Man, my Demon Slayer. Thank you. Food Wars, etc. Yep. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in the idea of it's a lot of people who are arguing against comics because they feel there's an exhaustion, or they want something. They feel that comics are the old thing. It's that old American thing that we did, where we want the new fresh thing, a thing from Japan. It's different. It's not normal. It's someone I would never meet that's creating this, and they're able to churn out a chapter a week.
Yeah, which is its own whole conversation about how hard that work is. But that's like really a whole episode. I agree though, James. Like for all we know, if distribution ever got better, maybe all of a sudden bande dessinée or comics from the UK could become way more popular if it became like really easy to pick it up at a good price. I mean, there's so many great comics coming out of Europe as well, is all I'm saying. Like we only get a like small fraction of that stuff.
Absolutely.
Somebody recently on Facebook had posted about a Mobius story that was going to be coming out later this year, and pre-orders are now available, and it's for a story that hasn't been translated before. So to that point, it's that accessibility that really makes the difference.
It's true, because we're all
I mean, the history. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. You first.
I talked over you. I'm sorry.
Okay, I was gonna say, like, this conversation is still also focused around mainly shonen anime too. We're not even talking about shoujo, josei, and all the other kinds of different genres.
Seinen.
Well, because we could sit here, we could talk about the Demon Slayers, My Heroes, and some of that, but Bell also got an excellent release, but you don't really hear a lot about it just because it seems as if there's way more of a push for shonen more there is for any other type of genre.
I mean, when the people talk about this online, they really are kind of going shonen and cape shit, right? Like, I mean, that's basically the equivalent. That's my new favorite thing is cape shit. Yeah, we get one per episode, I was told, so that's the one I'm using. And so it is already kind of like a narrow conversation. For me, I think a few things are happening here, right? I think they're all true in some way. The drivers of these discussions are kind of part of that clickbait economy, right? And they really want to talk about this in a way that's like mostly about superhero books, and particularly about superhero books from the 90s, which is also a whole other can of worms on top of that. But there are also people that are saying that for some time the superheroes aren't all the comics can offer, right? And they're right about that, like you guys have pointed out. And then you just got the younger generation, that's 13 to 30-year-olds, or probably even younger than that, truthfully. They grew up on, like James pointed out, Toonami, like, you know what I mean, and Yokai Watch and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Nintendo games. And so they also, manga's like the most natural progression for them as well. Like, so I think it's a lot of things happening all at once. But
Can I follow up on that, Troy? Like, one of the impressive things about the most manga that we see, and Kurenai's point, it is primarily shonen, but they don't just release the manga. They create the games, the toys, the collectibles, the TV shows and the movies. That doesn't always come together as a package in American comics. It's a very different approach. So it's very easy to get immersed in manga because you can like sort of get all this different stuff. If I'm into action figures, if I'm into movies, if I'm into video games, I can get into that thing a lot easier than certain American comics. And that's to say nothing for how affordable manga can be.
Right.
Well, I mean, and I also think another part of that too is, I think with manga and anime, you're more likely to be like, okay, I came from the video game, and it's the exact same story that was in the anime, and it's the exact same story that was in the manga. There's not much differentiation.
Yeah.
So if you're a fan, in the eyes of the fans, you're still a fan because they're all having the same experience,
There's no multiverse type thing like you get with like, Spider-Man has a great video game, but that's its own story.
You're right. Yeah. Exactly. Kurenai, were you about to say something? Sorry.
No, I was agreeing.
Okay. Actually, so all right, Chris, you brought up the price point, and I wanted to actually get into this because a lot of the reasons that people reference that manga is dominating this the American industry is because of the convenience of price. And I wanted to ask because like I've kind of always been of the attitude that look, here's my thing. I also can't really speak to this because I'm an adult with a job, right? So, and I know that like, if you're reading Demon Slayer or whatever, like, some of that audience is kids. I went to an elementary school this past weekend to taught kids about comics, and they definitely knew what Demon Slayer was, which was a little surprising actually. But it's interesting just because you can get a lot of story for $10, right, in a manga, and then for a $5 comic book that's a floppy essentially, from, let's say, for example, DC and Marvel, because people do compare these mostly, you'll get like a 15-minute read at most, So I'm curious, how much do you think price point and convenience impacts people's perception?
Incredibly,
Mm-hmm.
I would say. And especially when you get the 15 to 20 pages, you get that huge cliffhanger at the end. There's still, I have boxes of comics downstairs right next to my manga. There's still some that I have cliffhangers on that I'm so pissed about, So it's like, I think honestly, just, you always have to think about the fiscal impacts when it comes to these things too, because that does shift a lot of people. I mean, if I was a kid, when I was a kid, I looked at it and I'm like, I could pay $3 for this one issue, or technically I could pay $10 for the 7 issues, which is the manga.
Right, yeah.
The manga.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been in that position. I've gone to the 7-Eleven when I was like 14 and been like, all right, I can get this annual or I can get this one book. Like, you know what I mean? And so that's kid logic, right? When you're spending your money, the little bit of money you get from like your allowance or whatever.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, if American mainstream comics wanted to find a way to make it cheaper, I sincerely believe they could. I sincerely believe that Marvel and DC, if they really sincerely cared, they could flip a few switches and put out, say, like more like trade paperback stuff, which always sells well, black and white, like omnibuses. They could do that with a lot of the content that they've already created. We used to get those Marvel Epic collections, for instance, that were like black and white, and it was like $10 for like 100 issues or something crazy.
Yeah, right.
They could do that in, say, like a small tankobon format. They really could. I just don't think that they have a lot of motivation. I sincerely think that they're fine with things as is. They make a profit, and it's counted as intellectual property, and that's just sort of a something you sort of have to understand. I'd love for American mainstream comics to be bigger than they are. I don't think it would be very difficult for them to be. I just don't think that there's a lot of motivation behind the scenes. Whereas manga, for some reason, it's just like that bookstore market. It's cheap, it's affordable. I mean, and it's just so easy to jump into because it's typically one creator or creative team, and it goes from like volume 1 to volume 31. It's very easy to follow.
Well, so as you guys know, I work for the distributor, right? So I see a lot of different books coming in and out on a regular basis, right? I see a lot of different formats passed, and I will say this. Marvel tried to do the Tsunami line. I think the only really big thing that came out of that was Runaways. And those were like kind of repackaged as manga style books, right? I don't remember the price point was on that, but I also remember DC, and I guess they're still technically doing this, had the Black Label books, which I thought were really great. Because they felt more like something you would buy at an airport or something like that. It's just kind of a magazine-sized format that they were attempting to. So there's been like attempts here and there, and of course there's like with the Marvel Mangaverse stuff, and like DC had the 100-page giants that they were trying to move through Target, that had a bunch of like different stories in them as well. I always thought that was a great idea, truthfully.
They're great ideas. They're just very half-hearted. I don't think that they've like ever really put the whole marketing engine behind it to sort of like, promote what they've got going on. They're just sort of like testing the waters to see how easy it might be.
Sure. That's fine. I think you might have a point there. What about you, James? Price point, convenience?
So for me personally, like what I gravitate towards normally is what grabs my attention first and foremost. So for instance, this Super Mario manga for the longest time had caught my attention, but I'm like, I'm not sure if I want to get it. But finally, just one day I'm scooping it. But I want to go back a little bit in time. We were talking about Mai the Psychic Girl a little bit earlier. Talk a little bit about Viz and their attempt at doing floppies back in the day and trying to, how do we get comics into America? How do we get manga into the American comics scene and make this work? So this was $2.95, so $3 back in '98 or so. But that same issue here, this volume contains that entire story, and the price point for this $2 or so for maybe like 20 pages, nearly 200 pages here, and $10. Though I will say, I think for a lot of people, there is a bit of a hang up of when you're getting into series that have a lot of volumes, it is very scary to get at that box set because that is an investment. But I definitely would say that the price point does make a difference, because when I was in Narita Airport, I scooped up this issue of Shonen Jump off of the airport shelf along with this Gundam version of that.
They're so affordable.
Yeah, no, I think I didn't bust over. I think this one was about 700 yen for the Gundam one, and then
a little more than $5.
Yeah, and then roughly about 500 yen or so for the Shonen Jump. And for that same price point, you could get Shonen Jump monthlies back in the day, but the difference being, so. But I think a big...
Well, there's the collectability factor too. So like, because the ones you're showing that like, I pick them up sometimes when I go to Japan too. They're meant to be relatively disposable. Some people will keep them. A lot of people don't. They're printed on cheap newsprint. They're not printing as many as they did, say, in the 90s or anything, but it's still like basically millions of copies, and it's disposable. And that also kind of helps with the collectability factor when you go to like comic book stores and stuff. Like if you can find one in good shape for like the first appearance of somebody, that's a more special thing.
Yeah. No, I think I come from the Alan Moore attitude that comic books should be disposable. Like that was one of the things he said not too long ago that I was like, I completely agree. Like, and I think, of course, things are always going to be collectible. I feel like now we're seeing more and more, especially with geek merchandise, paraphernalia, anything's collectible. But at the same time, I think, not putting too much value on what these things are going to do on the speculator market is important. I treat my comics like shit all the time. I'll be honest with you.
I've got a pile of them down here to like my side. I just have a pile of them.
Like if I like sometimes I do stuff I know that would make people cringe, and I mean I put them into poly bags. They have their own little cabinet or whatever, but some are just sitting on top of the cabinet and then they've gotten crushed, and I'm just like, well now I got to keep you. So there's a lot of stuff.
Are you rolling it up and putting it in your back pocket?
I'm not going that far. Even as a kid, I never would do that. But I also came up reading these things like right at the speculator era where things were really getting hot for speculators. So some of that stuff was already ingrained in my mind. But at the end of the day, I just want to read it. So what is the current state of American comic books, you think, by comparison? So something's interesting is going on, right? Like I'm going to the shops, right, and I'm picking up my books, and I'll be honest, I'm enjoying a lot of the stuff I'm reading. And I can't even say that was necessarily true about maybe 3 years ago, but there's been a shift in quality that I really personally appreciate, right? And some of that is, just because people that I liked 3 years ago who were doing smaller books are now doing bigger books. That's sometimes the nature of things. But at the same time, I feel like everything is kind of working right now from a consumer's perspective. Look, you can find something to complain about any industry, right? And any format, right? Like we got all these streaming services right now, and I can't watch half of them, right? Or more than half of them. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that everything's bad. You know what I mean? But that seems to be the general take on American comic books. It's like all American comic books are trash, and manga is saving the day and making everything okay for the format. So I'm curious what you guys think is the current state of American comic books. Chris, you're leaning in, so I'm gonna let you go first.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think overall it's doing strong. I think it's doing as well as they want it or need it to be doing, and I think that every year, sometimes you just have to look closely, but there's always good stuff, even with the mainstream publishers. And I read all sorts of comics, foreign, domestic, old, new, mainstream, and indie. I read it all. But yeah, Marvel and DC always have a few really great books. I tend to just get to a point where I follow creators, and sometimes they get like to sort of, they'll just have a good take on a book, and they don't have to do a lot of crossover or event stuff. And, you get something like, I thought the Immortal Hulk run was like a really strong run, for instance, like it didn't have to deal with like crossing over a lot. It just told a unique story. And so you can still get that. You just have to sort of look a little bit sometimes, listen to recommendations, read reviews, figure out what you like. But I think that there's always good stuff and a bunch of crap. There just is.
There's always is. Right, exactly. What about you, Kurenai? What do you think about the current state of American comic books? Are you reading anything right now? Actually, I should also have asked you guys that.
Actually, I've done a bit of a shift because I go in waves because, when you're talking about how you can't watch everything, that's where I'm at right now. So I'm currently switched to manga. But I feel that there's definitely a bit of a switch happening where we are shifting from the big three to more indie titles. And because I hear more conversations about like webtoons and things like that more than I hear about, more DC and Marvel comics. And I feel that they're kind of shifting more gears because I feel the same way as Chris, that they're just like, you know what? We're complacent. And I feel the same. And of course, there's always going to be great titles. I think the last really nice title that I've been like shoving in people's faces was Superman All-American. And I thought that it was just a short run, 6 issues, but it was a solid story from front to back where it was, they very much, gave more depth to Superman that I've been looking for quite some time. But I feel that, there's more of a spin now where instead of seeking the big names, more people are taking creativity into their own hands. Or like really kind of like digging more into the indies, which I'm here for. I'm here for.
Wouldn't you also say that sometimes like the big names can get more creative freedom by just doing something at one of the slightly smaller publishers? Like James Tynion, writes plenty of stuff for DC and Image, but then he might want to like really stretch his creative muscles by working at, say, Boom or something like that. Like they're going to be pretty hands off.
They can be, yeah, right. And then even you also see a little bit too where they're kind of like they're taking these bigger characters and they're kind of throwing them somewhere else. Like there's a comic I'm reading on Webtoons now. So basically, my statement on manga just lied. It was Zatanna and the Ripper, where it's about Jack the Ripper and Zatanna, and they're kind of like going through this kind of like back and forth, and it's on Webtoons. There's another one where it's the Bat family, also on Webtoons as well. So I think there's a lot of mixing and matching right now that I'm really enjoying. So I do agree with you.
No,
the next generation, the argument will probably be like webtoon versus manga or something like that.
Right. I feel like we're in this wealth of access to comics right now, and I think it was Kristen mentioned earlier how hard it was to find know if a manga was good or not, right? Like, not only do we have channels like yours, Chris, right? But like on top of that, like, we can of course go to the comic shop and like have discussions with each other about these things. And then in addition to that, I'm reading more indie stuff or smaller publisher stuff in addition to the superhero stuff. So all my favorite superheroes are having good runs. And you talked about following creators. At this point, I'm a Chip Zdarsky fan. Like, if he does anything, I'm going to read it, He got me reading Batman again. And I haven't read Batman in like probably 10 years. You know what I mean? And so I can get stuff I missed, like on eBay or at a convention. I can go on Webtoons. I had a comic on Webtoons, and so, you have all these different avenues. And I think people kind of, for whatever reason, comic book nerds in particular, kind of forget these valuable lessons of sometimes the brew gets cold, it gets bad, you know what I mean? And nothing lasts forever. And it's okay to like splinter off and try other stuff when those things happen. Like, I don't need to read Spider-Man consecutively, but because I like Spider-Man, I will pop my head in every now and then and be like, oh, somebody doing something. Oh, okay, Chip Zdarsky's got a book. Oh, I'll read that. You know what I mean? So to your point, I think that sometimes we just have to be smarter consumers. You just can't devour anything. A lot of the arguments I hear from people are from the people that represent, truthfully, are the people that are like, oh, the 90s were so much better. The 90s were so much better. It's like, well, to a point, guys. And also, that's the binge era, right? Where people just consumed. And it was more about the gimmick and more about this and that than it was about the art or the story, after a while. So
it's also, whenever you get into comics, that was like the best era.
Yeah, of course. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Everything's all shiny and new. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. What about you, James? What do you think is the current state of American comic books?
Honestly, I think it's a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. And I think back to the point that I was making, like touching on the sort of like Marvel movie conversation, is that a lot of people end up sidestepping comics as a whole for these other avenues of how the properties from, say, a Marvel or DC are being presented, that they're not noticing what's happening in the comics and what might be happening in the indies. So I actually wanted to show this off in terms of when people feel like they're exhausted with Marvel and DC, I feel like they're not really paying attention to what might be happening in between the lines, because Marvel and DC put out some phenomenal comics back in the day that were just random goodies that came through. So Keith Giffen doing his thing with Lobo and Fantaside, and then Jim Mafu doing his own thing with Generation X.
Absolutely.
But then more contemporary, you got people like Trad Moore taking on Doctor Strange, and then Peach Momoko doing her own thing completely. And I feel like that's been a breath of fresh air in general. But for me, I got a whole stack here. Bear with me. I'm just going to run through these real quick.
No, I love the show and tell. This is I don't even have to put up the images.
Show all my comics.
Yeah, no, I pulled up a select few, but just random indies that come through from various publishers that I don't think a lot of people might know about or give a chance to. But these are all stuff that are out there available, whether it was in the last year or two or a couple of years. But there's some fantastic stuff that's come through that I think everybody should take a chance, whether it's through the comic shop or it's online, Kickstarters, or, maybe it's free comic book day and you're looking for something good, or maybe there's something that's been reprinted and get a chance to try it for the first time. But, there's all these different...
James, just like following up, my favorite part of conventions these days is going to Artist Alley, because there's always so much passion and you're going to find something. And I especially loved, Troy, you'll probably agree with me on this. Like, SPX isn't the biggest convention at all, but boy, is it one of the most fun, because the passion at the Small Press Expo is just incredible.
No, there's an energy that comes off of it that I definitely, literally, I think I was talking to a friend of mine not too long ago, an artist friend of mine. He was like, every time he walks out of there, he's like, I got to go make something. I'm like, I know what you mean. And so I think there's a lot of just great options out there. And, you know, I think that we tend to divide these things up into like, oh, comics are just this and comics are just that and comics are, but intellectually, we know that's not true, you know. I got some comments here that I want to throw up real quick. We got Mystical Green Beanie, who typically comments in some of our videos. He says there's also a cultural difference, I'm assuming, between American comics and manga. I think where anime is seen as a way to market the manga, whereas the opposite seems to be true in the West. You know what? Much was made about the recent shift of, just to get off the topic a little bit, of James Gunn taking over the DC's movie universe, right? And one of the things I noticed, and one of the things I noticed was well, I shouldn't say he, but one of the things I noticed that they started showing little packages at the end of these trailers for these movies saying DC Comics are available at your local comic shop, et cetera, et cetera. I have never understood why Marvel has never done that. And that has always driven me nuts. And I think that it behooves any publisher to like make sure that at least that is like an obligation of the studio that's picking up your property.
Imagine Troy, you're going to see Spider-Verse 2. Mm-hmm. You're waiting for the movie to start. And before you get that typical Marvel logo, they actually have a spotlight to say, go check out your local comic book shop. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like that's how you start the movie.
Yeah.
That's why I say like that would be the easiest thing in the world to do. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they don't is what makes me think that they just don't care that much. They're fine with things the way they are for some reason. Mm. I wish they would. I would love that. I love comics so much. I always want to spread the word. That's why I've got a show. Yeah. And manga and everything else that I consider comics. It's very frustrating.
Go ahead, Kurenai.
Oh, I was going to say, I agree, because even in the Super Mario movie, they went ahead, they blasted the Switch. I think 2 or 3 times before.
I mean, and that's because Nintendo was co-producing it, so they're like, they're like, okay, and we're going to put an ad in at the beginning. It's like, yeah, of course you are.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, the only thing that like the mainstream publishers seem to do is kill off their characters a few months before the movie comes out, bring them back right before the movie. It's kind of their new game plan. But like you were saying earlier, that like the manga and the anime and everything, it all matches. It's all the same story. It's like a literal adaptation. There's like so little to complain about. If you watch an anime, I mean, it is a literal adaptation.
Right.
Like more than 9 times out of 10. Like they're not changing a word.
Right.
Right. No, it seems like the only time manga or anime fans have to worry is when Netflix gets involved. So
that's like, that's an adaptation where instead of like some sort of a translation. But I know.
Okay, so I just wanted to wrap this up real quick. I guess. Well, actually, we got 5 minutes and 46 seconds. So you guys, it's 5:46. Sorry. You guys want to talk a little bit more about just your takes on. You guys were so concise in your answers. Like I was expecting this was going to go into a tangent or something in some shape or form. Did you guys want to talk a little bit more about maybe your own perspectives about why this conversation has become so heated in particular?
Because of social media.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Like this used to be the same kind of conversations we'd have in comic book stores.
Exactly.
Social media just amplifies a voice. Like, somebody could only have like 100 followers, but they make a point that like incites people and it's going to get retweeted and talked about is all it is. I'm just saying that like, that's the only reason I think that like, these conversations sort of blow up is just because it's so easy to sort of argue and debate stuff on social media. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It just is what it is.
I mean, it's the nature of the beast. And I think that it's definitely something that nerds in particular are going to do. Like, it's one of those things where I don't even try to combat anymore. I'm just sort of like, this is kind of the nature of it. Like,
it starts off as a fun thing, right? Like a mental exercise. You're going okay, like My Hero Academia versus like, New Mutants. Like, what's the same? What's different? Like, what's the, Demon Slayer versus like Blade? Like these are conversations that people will just like come up with impromptu, or they'll just like talk about, wow, I just discovered Akira, which has been out forever, but boy, that art is so detailed. That reminds me the energy, and it reminds me of Daniel Warren Johnson. It's like, well, these things influence one another.
That's okay. Let them figure it out. That's how I see it.
It's fun to figure out. It's great. It's great. It's great to like see sometimes when you're like, oh, you can tell going back, even into the 80s, like somebody like Frank Miller making Ronin, you're like, oh, he was getting pretty influenced by stuff like, say, specifically probably Lone Wolf and Cub was one of his influences and stuff. But that's really fun to discover, like when you really start digging into the history of comics and like learning this stuff for yourself, like seeing those similarities. I would say there's a lot more similarities in like manga and American comics than differences. But you're just going to have different like storytelling as sort of more of a cultural thing, like what stuff interests us here. Apparently, like power fantasies like still are like really interesting to us here in America. Right now, if you start reading like manga, all of a sudden like resurrection seems to be like a super popular trope to explore with like Oshinoko and stuff like that. There's all these like resurrection stories. Anyway, I don't know. It's just like there's going to be cultural differences, but the actual storytelling isn't necessarily that radically different. I think that they influence each other back and forth quite a bit.
To that point, I'm going to piggyback because I was going to do a little show and tell for stuff that people have been printing through us. But on that specific note of the influence going back and forth, this is a book that was printed at Comix Well Spring that follows the manga format to a T. So this is iridescent, and it's a great example of how the influence of manga is now influencing self-publishers, indie creators here stateside to see how they can make their own manga. So it's still comics, but they're trying to adapt those influences on how they do comics and present something new to our audience.
Yeah, it's distinctly stylized, and it's thoroughly becoming a part of popular culture. And that's and I think that also kind of goes back to why this argument is a thing now between manga versus comic books. It's thoroughly like to be able to see that I could purchase an Inuyasha shirt at Target. 90s me would not even fathom that could be a thing, but it's just so entrenched now, and it's so thoroughly like, intertwined into our pop culture now that it's
absolutely growing because like when I show something like like this the action scenes by somebody like Daniel Warren Johnson, lots of like inset panels, lots of motion blur and stuff on that really does remind me of hold on, I'm reaching back behind me to get something. The sort of like there's like Katsuhiro Otomo. It's not that different. It's not that different.
Yeah.
There's lots of it's anyway, but it influences each other back and forth too, because if you look at the history of manga, I mean, their influences were absolutely like the comic books left behind by GI soldiers during World War II. There's like no question that they were like tremendously influenced by American comics. They were like, this is great, let's do this.
Right, exactly right.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, I really think the American industry is becoming healthier because it's becoming more diverse. And, that's not just about the people behind the scenes, but also just in terms of the type of stuff that you can get and what people recognize about the format as what comic books are. Like, and I mean, I love the superhero stuff. I absolutely love the superhero stuff. I've never had a problem, and I will continue to read the superhero stuff, but, the fact that DC and Marvel's market share might be minimizing, even and it's really just a little bit. I also want to point that out. Isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just shows that the medium is expanding and growing, and more types of people are taking a look at it.
Do you think that like manga, like the popularity, do you think it will lead to more interest in diverse storytelling, or is manga it's just sort of own little fluke, and the average reader doesn't necessarily want to experiment with other stuff? Like I'm genuinely curious. I don't know if I have a question, because this is coming from another culture. It is popular. There's no arguing that.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the reasons why and the differences, but do you think that like this will eventually lead to readers experimenting with other types of storytelling, or is it just manga is all they're interested in for some reason because it's cool and that's it? I don't know.
So I was just on Discord the other night chatting with people about this chat, and somebody brought up the fact that they were trying to get their daughter into reading manga for the first time, but they were having difficulty understanding the reading flow, as with Western comics we go
Z pattern.
yeah, and then it's flipped for manga, and their
Mhm.
daughter just couldn't grasp that. Also, they were extremely tired because it was late at night, so who can blame that on that? But for me, I think it's a matter of exposure. It's a lot of the idea of how are we in comics culture, and also manga culture, just in general, comics culture as a whole, helping educate people outside of sort of our sort of tribes of comics. How are we helping expose things beyond just, are you going to go see Spider-Verse 2 tonight? How are we teaching people about the indies and the other sort of offshoot things from the mainstream? And what if there's those comics that you didn't check out from ages past that you might have didn't give a chance on, but is incredibly just breathtaking? You know, there have definitely been a lot of comics that I've been catching up on that I didn't grow up with, but say like Love and Rockets being something
So good.
that I didn't even humor it before, but somehow I'm slowly but surely like starting to absorb these things because I've stepped into other groups and spheres that have introduced me to these things that I otherwise wouldn't have been aware of.
So, James, what do you think might have been a turning point or an influence when you started trying some of this more indie and different stuff? Like, I'm curious what inspires comic book readers to try some more diverse storytelling and stuff. I'm genuinely curious about that.
So
Any ideas?
Oh, I actually remember it was Warp 9 Comics in Clawson, Michigan. I was browsing around for what Spider-Man comic or something of the sorts that I can get at. And I just remember looking at the shelf and seeing on the far end Saga's #1, like 5th printing. And for some reason in me at that point in time, I just wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to do something different to help get me outside of this bubble I was always contained in. And then later on, my current editor and buddy, Miles Van Meter, who's working at Vault of Midnight, introduced me to a bunch of other things that I otherwise wouldn't know of. And then I think for all of us who've been keeping tabs on them, Cartoonist Kayfabe has been doing a phenomenal job in sort of peeling back a lot of layers of what we know as comics and showing so much more that for me it's been like going to comics college essentially, because it's educating me in ways I'm getting schooled every other episode pretty much.
Yeah, no, Jim and Ed are smart guys, and I love what they're doing for comics and sort of going into techniques and history. They're great.
Hey, Chris.
Chris, go ahead.
You asked, okay, I'm going to jump back a little bit because you asked a really interesting question, right? This notion of like, will this generation branch out into making new types of comics, right? Because of their influence in manga, right? Is that what you were getting?
Or reading.
Or reading, right.
Or reading, yeah.
Or where they start reading it. First of all, Kurenai, looked like you were about to say something, so I was going to let you jump back in.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was actually saying, I was like, it kind of ties into the formatting that James was talking about. I was like, I think that instead of the actual book formats, digital would probably suit best because a lot of them kind of, especially when it comes to the younger age, they gear more towards that. A lot of like that scrolling format would probably be easier for them to ingest just because that's what they're so used to. From going back and forth when it comes to, I know that's when it came to my nephew, kind of like reading comics to him growing up and all that other kind of stuff too. You know, that was one where it was easier for him to transition from the scrolling to going backwards and forwards and making sure he treats my manga right. Started that way first, and then we grew to the physical forms for it too. So I think that.
I think also, and like, I don't know if this is an answer necessarily, but I think that like this is just what I've observed in the last couple of years, right? And like in the Black nerd spaces, very specifically, right? You see the anime and manga influence being much larger than the superhero stuff at this point. Like, at least that's been my experience, right? It's just like you see more of these characters showing up at conventions, and I've noticed that now we're getting artists who are not Japanese, like, you know, demanding that they be called mangaka, right? And I think that that's kind of interesting, just because that in itself, I think, might be the influence kind of taking a new form, you know? So you're getting like Black creators, like, who are saying like, you know, I want this title. Like, I don't want to be called a cartoonist. I want this title, even though it's technically still a cartoonist, right? And I don't know if that's
Troy. I just have a piece of this.
Yeah,
I just have something related, like super quick. Larry Hama I interviewed once, and you know, he said you don't get to call yourself an artist. You can call yourself like the job, like a cartoonist, but you don't get to call yourself, like, you have to have other people confer that title on you. And I sort of feel like mangaka is a title. I just want to say that I think that, like, you know, people can ask for it, but I think it's really up to the readers to give you the title if they're going to call you an artist or a mangaka.
That's fair. I mean, it is a job, and that's true. Like, you have to kind of earn that credit as well. No, I mean, and like, it's like I said, I don't think that that's necessarily answered what you're saying. It's just something that I've observed is like the influence of manga in general these last like couple of years has kind of shifted what potential artists who want to be in this field or want to be labeled, and how like what they perceive as tropes, right? You know, are like what those tropes are now. Like, you know, now they represent more of what manga tropes are, you know, versus what American comic book tropes are, you know?
I'm just curious to see. I'm just curious to see, like, because this is something I don't really know. I don't know how to do the research on this necessarily. Do people that get primarily into manga, that are here in the West, that like you know, like read primarily manga, does it make them open to eventually trying other stuff, say like indie titles or titles written by, you know, like, you know, I don't know, an anthology by queer people, or, you know, a biography by a Black writer or something like that? Does it make them more open to like reading different types of stories, or do they like tend to stay with what they have? I don't know. That's something I'm very curious about. Like, if there are any trends there.
I mean, we talked about Tsunami. I talked about Tsunami and some of the other stuff, the manga, Mangaverse stuff and whatnot, right? And I definitely think that stuff is how you can kind of get those readers to transition into reading other stuff. And I think that's kind of happening by default. I actually want to point out a comment here real quick. Mystical Green Beanie saying the manga adaptation has always been there. I think even going back to the 90s, a lot of Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee work seems very inspired by 80s manga, right? And I didn't see that at the time in the 90s, right? But I definitely, especially Jim Lee, I see that now for sure. And I think that you're going to see more of that moving forward. Like we kind of saw that a little bit a couple of years ago at some of the big two, where it's like some of these styles were more manga influenced, even on the major titles, you know. And now that DC's gone back to like a house style, and you know, but I think that's going to be more of what you're going to see. What are you going to say, Kurenai?
Oh, I lost my thought.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. No, you're fine. I was talking. You were bringing up the topic, Chris, about the current about how people are open. I've seen it branch, and I've also seen people like hunker down. But I've noticed that when it comes to more of a younger audience, I see more of the hunkering down. Where I see more of an older anime audience, they actually kind of branch out from not just manga, but then manhwa from Korea, but then also like little things here and there. So like French comics as well, and all that kind of stuff. Which, I mean,
hey Google, turn the lights blue. Sorry. Sorry, I thought I was muted. My bad.
No, color theory is important in both manga and.
Yes. Way to bring it home.
Right, but I have seen. I see that there are points where the curiosity, like light bulb, hits when it comes. It's like, oh man, it's like I've enjoyed this so much. What else can I enjoy? And then we go back to the consuming. As well as, like there's sometimes when people kind of figure out, yeah, this is an adaptation for anime, and it's right down to the T, like a lot of stuff. But then there are also shows where that kind of buds that same curiosity you're talking about, like when 4Kids did their everything, because that Yu-Gi-Oh is not the same as the manga. Sailor Moon was not the same.
That's true. That's a very good point.
Tokyo Mew Mew, definitely not the same as the manga. But that also kind of, especially when a lot of folks that are older and they kind of witness and see these kind of things, I'm like, and see the differences as well as see the things that they're ingesting currently. You kind of see that curiosity blossom and go through, like trying to pick and see if there's other things that they'd be into as well.
Actually, let me jump back into the comments real quick. I came into the wrong part of this comment earlier. I want to get the full context. So this is someone who's agreeing with you, Chris, in terms of like the title that a creator can hold, right? Unless it's for the Japanese audience in general, it's not manga. It could be inspired, but it's not manga. And then I was followed by, I'm Japanese, so they get to make me all they want.
This reminds me of how within hip hop culture, a b-boy or b-girl doesn't really get their title until someone gives it to them, and the same could be said to a certain degree with DJs. It's a lot more fun when your friends can give you that title, or something happens that gives you that title. But I wanted to piggyback a little bit on the idea of people reading manga that are either trying to expand or getting a little bit trying to tighten down on what they're reading. I'd love to just take any of these people who are just like, I don't want to read anything else. It's Shonen Jump or nothing. To just plop them out and plop them into some of these Japanese conventions like Komitia or Comic-Ket, where there's like 10,000 plus exhibitors, not attendees, exhibitors with 4-foot tables.
Yeah, and it's like lots of fan art type stuff, doujinshi.
Yeah, and the fact that it's books, like they're bringing it's fan books, but that doujinshi is just, it could be something that I think could really open a lot of these readers' eyes to something new and bridge that with a bit of familiarity.
I agree. Those places are gorgeous chaos, aren't they? Because everybody's rushing, everybody knows exactly where they need to go, and then you're just lost in the sauce if you do not have a plan.
Yeah, if you're not prepared ahead of time, good luck.
I think I have a Baldo here who's kind of piggybacking off of what I was trying to say earlier. It's just TV makes new influences in what we read. Example, Star Wars Vision has opened up new readers into manga. He says Magna, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, I think that, the influence is permeating our culture in various ways. And we're kind of at this point, I don't know, would you guys say we're like the third generation of like anime kids at this point? Like, or maybe the fourth, I don't know, because I kind of think about like, so I look at, I think of Astro Boy and Speed Racer, right? And then you get into you kind of jump forward a little bit, you get to Robotech, right? And then you're starting to get into the Project A-ko, Akira, Appleseed era, right? And then after that, I want to say is Sailor Moon, right? And that's a whole era in itself. So I don't know how many generations that is. This is probably like maybe five at this point.
Well, I think some of those are crossing over, Troy.
Some of those crossing over,
yeah. Like how many generations have been exposed, you're saying, like to anime stuff? I'd say probably closer to 4.
Closer to 4, right?
Yeah. But after that, you get probably like started like with the oldest of Generation X, because I don't think that like really boomers were as exposed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, like what when Astro Boy and Speed Racer coming out, they didn't know what it was. Like
probably a good way we can like section things off is from Speed Racer to about the point we were getting like Voltron in the late 80s, so like Shogun Warriors happening in between there, and then the VHS era with Akira starting the next generation that leads into the Toonami era, and then the 2000s kind of taking the next step on there.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's already part of the culture in a lot of ways. Like it's kind of already you know, in a weird way, it's American pop culture is already kind of consumed it in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, I feel like Toonami is almost like the remixing of it into American culture to make it palatable to us in a lot of ways, right? So,
I mean, there's so many millennials that still have their Pokemon cards.
yes.
Right? Like, it's thoroughly been intertwined into it. So it's just nice that, you know, we're getting more like a nice plethora of different things to be able to just go to a random theater and catch a Dragon Ball movie whenever it comes released. Like, 9-year-old me would be obsessed.
Right. Or re-releases for that matter. Like the fact that I got to see Ghost in the Shell in the theater. Because like I sure as hell didn't get a chance to see it when it originally came out. Like, you know, it's sort of like, oh, that's amazing. Mr. Green Bean to give you a compliment, James, saying I like the cut of your jib, James. American Dojinshi for the win.
Yeah, no, I also want to give a shout out to a lot of the publishers that have been reissuing a lot of old manga. So things like Captain Harlock or Esmeralda. You got Lupin the Third that had a collected edition that came out not too long ago, like a best hits of sorts, and then Kamen Rider as well that came out. So I think there's also been a real appreciation of going back and showing people, hey, here's something you might have missed.
Well, I think that they have to start digging into some of their older archives at this point and redoing stuff a little better because, you know, there's still only so much new stuff that's going to appeal over here. That's why, you know, like stuff like Fist of the North Star is another one that's like, you know, an older manga, but it's like now people can read that and go, oh, Fist of the North Star inspired, you know, Berserk and JoJo. Got it. You know, like, yeah.
Well, guys, thank you very much, man. I appreciate you for like coming in and just hanging out with me and talking about this. I kind of had an impression that this wouldn't be much of a debate. I feel like each of us are like, you know, at least knowledgeable enough to kind of like look at this whole thing and be like, okay, this is a benefit to the industry.
You wanted more arguing?
Well, you know what? I didn't expect it, to be honest. I was really leaning towards like, let's just talk some common sense into YouTube for 5 seconds. Okay. And like, you know, then they'll forget about it immediately thereafter. But at least we got through to at least I think about 20 people were watching. And so hopefully, and after that, more will get hip to this concept. Okay. Real quick, let's do shout outs. So let me take it over to Chris actually. Where can people find you?
On YouTube. Comic Tropes is my main channel. There I do fully edited videos looking at techniques by artists and writers or sometimes a unique piece of comic book history. And then I do a weekly live show on a second YouTube channel called Pros and Cons. I do like about a 2-hour show recapping the comic book news and the comics that came out in the past week, talking live with viewers a little bit like this. So, yeah.
All right, cool. What about you, Kurenai? What are you up to and where can people find you?
Yes. So I am currently starting my own convention. You can find all of my personal stuff because I do go to Artist Alley. I table at Artist Alleys about like 15 to 20 different Artist Alleys a year. You can find everything under Kurenai Kiba, but my convention is known as KhromaKon, which is a new convention happening in Baltimore, March 1st to the 3rd of 2024. And you can find that also on all platforms. KhromaKon with 2 Ks like Kurenai Kiba.
All right. Actually, we'll talk about that more because down on the table. And what about you, James? What do you do and where can people find you?
So first and foremost, I consider myself a cartoonist. I've been really getting back into comics more. So if anybody's interested in seeing sort of the journeys that I'm going on with a lot of my current book as I get closer to wrapping that up, you can follow me at Easterly Art on pretty much any social media. And then when it comes to Comix Well Spring, the go-to comic book printer, plug. Just look up Comix Well Spring on social media. And I just real quick, one more last show and tell bit. I want to give these 2 creators props. So we got Peppermint Desert by Sean Peacock and Space Knight by Kevin Anthony Catan. That absolutely phenomenal books that came through the shop. And it's one of the exciting things working at Comix Well Spring to see people bringing their own books to life with their own vision. So
absolutely love to see it. And you can find me every week here on Previews World, of course, and also you can check out my comics at rexhill-comics.com. And actually, since you're watching Previews World right now, I want to give you guys a reminder. June's Previews catalog is available now, whether you like superheroes or manga or about golf or YA comics or mecha. It's all in there. Get yourself a digital copy, a print copy at your local comic shop, or head to previeusworld.com/catalog and browse the entire catalog for free. So there you go. All right. Thanks again, guys. I appreciate you for joining me. Thanks for watching as well, guys. Thanks for commenting for those of you who are watching. And yeah, just spread the word. There's nothing wrong with the industry. Everything's cool. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a more diverse industry is a healthy industry, and I think that that's what we're seeing. And I think that's ultimately been the gist of this conversation. So spread the word and let people know. And as always, I'll see you at the spinner rack. Catch you guys later.